It's probably a super weird thing to be thinking about Thanksgiving and Halloween when you're picking your watermelons in peak summer harvest. But buddy, it's time to start thinking about your fall garden. In spring, we're super eager to get seeds in the ground and get started gardening again. We also are constantly playing roulette with making sure that we plant our seeds as early as we possibly can get away with doing without having to have negative repercussions later. In the fall, we have the exact opposite problem. We want to capitalize on the maximum doubling power of having more sun power, but most of our fall crops are cool-loving plants that don't like to be too hot. So again, we're playing a little bit of roulette, hoping that it's not too hot for too long so that our cool-loving fall plants don't actually bolt and go to seed too early in the season and not actually give us the produce that we as lazy gardeners actually want. So what can we actually plant in our fall garden? Honestly, that has a lot to do with what day it is currently on the calendar and how many days are left until your area's first frost date, which can be ascertained on the Googles. Here in Middle Tennessee, as of today, we have 73 days left, which means that if I were to look at the back of basically any one of these seed packets in here, I can ascertain how many days to harvest I have. And so if it's under 73 days, we're good to go. And if it's not, well, try again next year. With one very particular exception, and that is garlic. In here we have garlic seed, which to my utter fascination and excitement, takes just a short 4 years to make garlic. Late summer / early fall, depending on how long your growing season is exactly the time you want to plant your garlic in your garden. But most people plant garlic cloves, little sections of a garlic head that each one, over the freeze-thaw situation that happens during the winter, will go through a very fancy process called the vernalization process, wherein that one clove will have gotten bigger and then will split into a bunch of different cloves that then makes a head of garlic. However, when we plant the garlic seeds or the garlic Bilbo Baggins, year one, will get a little round, shrivelly head like this. We'll let that mature through the early spring, harvest the scapes, make scape pesto, and then replant the cloves of this weird bulbous thing in the fall, which then year two will look like this. A little tiny head of garlic. And to be fair, all of this is in fact very potent, useful garlic if you just want to eat that garlic. But after we have harvested the scapes and then harvested the head, in the fall we plant this again, which then by year 3 or 4, depending on the variety, turns into nice big boys like this, which is the true dream. And in case there's any cooks present, if you're ever looking at a recipe and it calls for 1 clove of garlic, there's clearly a typo. You need 1 head for everything that you would ever put garlic in. And that's, by the way, why I never get bit by mosquitoes. Vampires, it turns out, don't really like garlic. Weird. As a lazy gardener and the daughter of the cheapest human alive, this is my favorite way to buy seeds, aka harvesting them for free from my garden. But I also recognize that not everyone has a garden already established and understands enough about seed collection and storage and germination and all those things to actually get the seeds that they want to germinate. So here's the way that I organize all of my purchased seeds. They're organized in the order of the season in which they are best planted, or however that English makes sense. And in that, most seeds that you might buy just at the store or online come in this size, which is maybe 100 or 200 seeds for anywhere from $7 to $12. That's ridiculous. We as lazy gardeners want to buy seeds in bulk, aka by the pound or something kind of resembling a pound. Granted, if you are gardening in a smaller space, buying something like arugula or basil or whatever this is in this quantity seems probably pretty ridiculous. But considering when seeds are stored properly, aka in the fridge, they last for up to 300 years. I feel like if it's a seed we like, we could probably use these sometime in the next 300 years. As lazy gardeners, we generally try to avoid artificial watering as much as physically possible. However, our fall garden is often the one time that we really do have to water a little bit more, or at least think about watering a little bit more, because we need our fall garden seeds to germinate in the hot, late summer sun, which often also involves very little rainfall, at least here. To that end, one of my favorite lazy gardening tips is to use expandable hoses, because this is a 100-foot hose that weighs about 7 pounds when it's compressed. Granted, you do have to have really high water pressure to actually make these things expand the way that they need to, but good news of great joy, this faucet is at the end of a very steep hill, and as most things do, water flows downhill. Also, quick connectors are the biggest lazy gardening hack ever, because they are quick to connect and stuff. Here are a few quick tips with regard to making sure you get the most out of your fall plants. The first tip is to let every single plant you can possibly actually let go to seed actually go to seed. And here is a perfect example of that. This is, just like over there, some butter crunch lettuce that I literally just put some fertile mulch, which is a fancy way of saying I had some wood chips that were also buried near some compost handy, and I put them right on top of those lettucey plants that are still in the process of decomposing. And this is basically just so that I can keep using this space while I wait for whatever's gonna happen with these bad boys to actually happen. The other tip is to create a nice little medley of seeds and broadcast seed them, because the more seeds that you've put out, the more chances that you have of more seeds actually sprouting. And to that end, I often will make a fall planting medley grab bag, if you will. I'll put it in the fridge, and it will, in the fridge, experience something called cold stratification, which is a very fancy way of saying you've told the seed that, you know, some of the things that should stimulate its growth have happened. And so they happen in the fridge, and then they're ready to broadcast seed, which again is just another fancy way of saying, hey, I've got a whole bunch of asparagus, spinach, kale, and other cold stratified seeds in this little bunchie here. I am going to toss a whole bunch of them out here, kind of rake it around and disturb the soil, and then keep this soil mostly moist and hope for the best. There's a couple tips for keeping your soil moist without having to constantly have to water it. Hold, please. A lot of seeds will germinate best when they are in a cold, dark, damp environment. And we can create that mostly with a piece of hose-soaked cardboard that we lay on top of the soil and allow those seeds to germinate. Here's the trick though. Here in Tennessee, it's very hot. We're in the middle of a drought. If I just lay this cardboard on top of the soil, I'm gonna have a few problems, because this cardboard is gonna dry out very quick. It's also windy this time of year. It's gonna blow right off my garden bed. So I want something to weight this cardboard down and also kind of trap some of the moisture inside of it. And therein lies one of my favorite garden tips. We take some of our cold stratified seeds, we broadcast them, aka throw a bunch of them on top of the soil's surface, willy-nilly, like this. And then we take our cardboard, we lay it atop them, and then we weight that cardboard down with the cold frame tops of our raised beds that we use as cold frames in the winter. So this is this. Darn tootin', this is, ooh, oh my lands, okay. This is the set it and forget it method of fall planting, except for the important thing is that you don't actually forget it, because the moment that the seed has germinated, we need to remove the covering, or we will also just solarize and or squash the seedling, and it'll never come up. And in an ideal world, as a true lazy gardener, I wouldn't have to actually use the cardboard at all. I could simply just put my cold frame top on top of the soil and that would be that. The problem with that is that this clear surface on top of black dirt, accepting the sun's good graces, will make it far too hot under a clear surface, which is why we put the cardboard down first. Again, to create a dark, moist environment for the seed to germinate. And generalizations are always a bad idea, but as a general rule, most of the garden seeds that we'll plant in the fall germinate in about 7 to 14 days. So don't ever leave this on here for more than 7 to 14 days, and you'll be good. For those of us who love absolute info dumps, here's a list of my favorite fall garden plants to plant, their days to germination, and the soil requirements, etc. Maybe some tips. Let's just go. Spinach. Days to harvest, 30 to 50 days. Soil and watering conditions, spinach prefers well-drained, loamy soil rich in organic matter, which basically just means a lot of wood chips, poops, and other things. Obviously, if you're going to use the poops, make sure they're well composted first. Spinach prefers to have a soil pH of 6.5 to 7, but if you stick around on this channel long enough, we're going to talk a whole lot about why pH in your soil doesn't actually matter. Kale. Days to harvest, 50 to 75 days. Kale thrives in fertile, well-drained soil with a pH between 6 and 7.5. Water it consistently to keep the soil moist, but do not water it too much or the plant will drown. We've actually talked about this in the "You're probably killing your garden with watering something having to do with watering your garden" video that you can find in the description or the link somewhere around here. If your area tends to have a lot of brassica pests, aka things like kale, broccoli, etc., like white cabbage moths or flea beetles or the brassica beetles that are just really, really persistent here, it's sometimes beneficial to start your fall kale plants indoors, but that really seems like a lot of work, so I just buy my kale seeds in bulk, broadcast spread them, and hope for the best. Carrots. Days to harvest, 70 to 80 days, except of course when you plant them in the late fall and you hope for the best, and if they actually survive, they make it to the spring and you then pick them in the spring, and they're really, really sweet and wonderful, but that's a bit of a gamble. Carrots do best in soils that have moderate amounts of potassium and phosphorus, but they really do not like soil that is high in nitrogen because, like their friends beets and parsnips, carrots are rooting vegetables. You want the roots, you don't want greenery. And if you plant a carrot seed in soil that has way too much nitrogen in it, it will grow tons of green foliage, but very little roots. So unless you want a short, stubby carrot, please don't plant it in your donkey poop. Broccoli and other things in the brassica family are going to put all of their growth above the soil. So unlike rooting vegetables like carrots and beets and other things that grow below the soil, these green vegetables like broccoli, lettuces, and other things want a ton of nitrogen because a ton of nitrogen is going to give them the above the soil advantage that they really need to thrive. Because these have a 60 to 100 day maturation period, you want to make sure that you are planting them early enough and or that you have a mild enough winter that you're not going to have issues with them overwintering. But also, if you have a short growing season, it's probably super wise to start your brassicas indoors to let those grow into little seedlings and then plant them in the late summer and hope for the best. Broccoli, broccoli rabe, cauliflower, and Brussels sprouts, and all other kind of related plants are very likely going to get quite tall. So staking them or putting some kind of stake or a tomato cage around them is pretty wise because, especially here in Tennessee, it gets really windy during the winter and the early spring, and it's important to have some support, as I think we as humans also need. Cabbage, another thing in the brassica family that is quite delicious, has a 65 to 100 day planting to picking harvest time. Like so many other plants, it likes a soil pH of 6 to 7.5%. It likes a lot of nitrogen in the soil because, again, it has a pretty tiny root system and a very big above the ground system, and nitrogen helps support that. Cabbage is extremely susceptible to slugs and snails, so if you live in a very wet, humid, moist climate, put some cheap beer in little troughs around your plants, and or watch my pests in the garden video and you can come up with some other solutions for protecting your precious plants in that regard as well. Beets, just like carrots, have a 60 to 80 days planting to harvest time, and they, just like carrots, are a rooting vegetable. So you don't want them in super nitrogen heavy soil. You want enough potassium and phosphorus to support the root growth. And of course, because it is in fact a root, you want loose, well-drained soil, not super hard, compacted, high in nitrogen soil, because that is the exact opposite of the conditions you want for something that is going to grow a root instead of a top. Swiss chard is absolute garbage when it comes to the food and or nutritional value, taste, etc. of a plant, but it is actually pretty pest resistant and quite robustly growing. And so if you want to look like a good gardener and take lots of pretty pictures of absolutely disgusting inedible vegetables in your garden, chard is a great option. 60 to 80 days to harvest. It wants moderate amounts of nitrogen for leaf production, and some of the other good gardening things are there, but honestly, it's basically a weed, so you can toss some chard seeds in and they'll probably thrive. Lettuce has a 30 to 60 day harvest. So if you're really late in your gardening season and you're just thinking about your fall garden for the very first time at this exact moment, never worry, never fear. Lettuce and radishes are going to make you look like a good gardener regardless, because they have the shortest growing span and a pretty big bang for their buck, because most salads include lettuce. Though I prefer to let my animals actually eat my greens for me and turn them into delicious steaks and other things that I can combine with garlic and butter and make even better. Peas are a classic spring and fall vegetable that massively benefit from having their seeds soaked for a day and a half about prior to planting them in the ground. But honestly, I've had fantastic luck with growing peas in the exact same spot year after year after year, because generally I have planted my peas along my trellises and enough other stuff has grown up around them early enough in the season that they reseed themselves and I never really have to think about it. But if you are starting from scratch at this exact moment, take your bag full of pea seeds, put them in some water, and then tomorrow put them in the soil, baby them a little bit. Good nitrogen is helpful, well-drained soil is helpful. But honestly, peas are pretty low maintenance, low hanging fruit vegetables. Here we are in the Start a Lazy Garden from Scratch example garden bed that we established in the Start a Lazy Garden from Scratch video earlier this season. And one of the things I first want to point out is how much mycelium and other stuff we've got going on in the garden bed already. This is really good news bears. You might also notice the lack of the tomatoes and other things that we planted, and that is because I planted determinate tomato varieties, knowing that we would probably have to do a bed reset to make sure that we had enough ground cover late in the season to actually keep the things alive, which is why a couple weeks ago I planted these watermelon vines. And with these vines, we're gonna get a bunch of extra late season shade over our garden that, again, because it's its first year, is going to struggle a little bit more than year 5 back behind us does, with a complete and utter lack of care, water, etc. Especially in this late season when there is not that much water to begin with. And so amongst these watermelon vines, I am going to broadcast seed a whole bunch of fall garden seeds, pretty much willy-nilly, onto the soil surface, give it a quick sprinkle, and hope for the best. And the way I'm going to go about planting these is extremely lazy. Here we are. The good news is the seeds that don't come up this year will very likely come up another year. Because what did we learn from the Weeds Are Good video? The storage of seeds in the soil can store seeds for, cultivated seeds probably about 40 years conservatively, but some of the native varieties that we might have around can sit in that seed bank for 300 years, just basically waiting for the right conditions. And then in that glorious moment, they spring forth vigorously and healthily, Or sometimes they just peter out and die, and that's just part of lazy gardening. And my lazy solution for getting those seeds planted at exactly the right depth is to grab a little scoopy of compost, sprinkle it on top, and hope for the best. The lazy way. And while I'm at it, I'm going to feed my lazy way of growing potatoes without actually having a garden bed prepared for them, because all of my potatoes that I got from the store started sprouting and I didn't have anywhere to put them, so I just put them in these random buckets, and some have fared better than others, but at least we'll get some taters out of the deal. I feel like people have made gardening so much more intimidating and so much harder than it needs to be for so long, when the reality is, especially if we do things the smart way, we can experiment, and if things fail, we have so little ventured in the venture that we don't actually lose anything. But every year we gain knowledge about what might work and what definitely doesn't. If you're in any way confused as to why I put compost on top of our pre-mulched garden, here's the thing. Gravity is a heck of a drug. And if we simply now just rake the soil top where we just sprinkled those seeds and then sprinkled that compost, all of the finer compost and the finer seeds float to the bottom and the mulch ends up on top. No need to move, no need to relocate. The biggest thing here is that we're not raking in a sequential motion, or we might accidentally rake all of our seeds into one tiny little section. But in doing this, we get things to sink down to the level they kind of need to be, and our mulch ends up on top. After we've done all that, all we have to do is give it a quick sprinkle, and by quick I mean probably one overnight water with an overhead sprinkler, just to fully saturate the soil, and then the mulch, the mushroom, fungus, the mycelium should do its job and we'll be golden. Something I recently learned, which is counter to everything I learned growing in Washington, which is perhaps why it took me 5 years to actually learn and apply it, is that here in the South, strawberries are best planted in the fall, which will then give you an early spring harvest. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the weather here during the winter is not nearly as harsh as it is other places, so a newly transplanted strawberry crown is going to be a lot more successful in a climate like this than it would be in a much colder climate like we moved here from. That's weird English, but it's okay. And as such, my 5-year-long project of strawberry propagation, initially in service of weed suppression around the edges of my garden, is about to actually pay off. Because I knew when I planted these guys way too close together and started propagating them like crazy, that someday I was gonna have a ton of plants to put in my new, bigger garden, and I wouldn't have to pay an extra penny for them. And today is that day. Fall is the best time to plant our strawberries, so I'm gonna use my broad fork to break up the ground around all of my strawberry crowns. I'll pull them up one by one, remove all of the foliage except for one leaf. This is easier done with scissors, by the way, and replant them over there in the new garden pond orchard giant expansion project that we'll show you in just a second. If you watched our early summer garden tour video, you saw me taking a weed whacker and a shovel to my dahlia patch to thin it from the main gardening area, and I brought all those tubers over here just to throw them out in the wild and see how they did. And I'm very pleased to say that they did great. Look it, we even have a flower already, and it's been a month. But back to the fall planting situation. I wanted to have a pumpkin patch, and I had great dreams of what it was going to look like, but at this point I literally just want the pumpkins. So buckle up. Here's some real fast pumpkin planting gold, and we'll see if it works. All right, what are we doing with a weed torch, you might ask? Hopefully not starting a forest fire, but don't worry, we have high humidity here. These little lines in here serve a really delightful purpose, and that is giving us a general planting guide. Oops. Ooh, that was too much. Sorry. Too much.
You just like annihilated that thing.
Too much. Well, that's actually fine. I wish it was a little smaller. Oh, there we go. There we go, okay. So pretend these enormous holes where my weed torch got away from me don't exist, and focus on the holes that we actually like. But here's the thing, there's no mistakes in gardening, just learning opportunities. It's just weird that I didn't learn this the last 30 times I did it. But here we are. So we're gonna reach down into this hole, get all the way down to some of the moist compost at the bottom of the hole, drop a couple different seeds in it, because I'm not sure of the viability of any of those self-collected seeds, cover it up with mulch, and we'll come back and thin as necessary.
You know, you probably could just cut it.
That seems like a lot of work. We're lazy gardeners. I feel like my pumpkin patch is the perfect example of having a great idea, but not being so precious about it that if it's not going to be perfect the way you wanted it to be, it's still okay just to do a smaller, easier version of it in the last exact window of time to actually plant it, which is what we're doing here, because I had grand hopes of what we would do in this area, and it didn't get done. But am I going to waste all the effort I put into it and not plant my giant pumpkin patch the way I wanted? No, I'm gonna find a smaller, easier way, and if I only get one pumpkin, boy howdy, this is gonna be worth it, because next year I'll have learned some lessons that I can then use in next year's pumpkin patch. I always get a little depressed thinking about my fall garden, feeling really limited in the options that I have, until I remember that we actually still have 2 more full succession plantings worth of time when it comes to most things in the cucurbit family. And that fall garden really needs to have some pumpkins in it. Guess what pumpkins are? Cucurbits. But because cucurbits really don't like to be transplanted, they like to be direct sown. And oftentimes at this point in the summer garden, we're still in peak harvesting season of all the summery things, and I don't have quite the same amount of room for my wintry things that I would otherwise have. Which is why I then direct sow a lot of my second to last succession plantings of cucurbits in larger pots that will be able to sustain them for their full life cycle. That's a real mouthful, but basically, to simplify it all, we've got a whole bunch of zucchinis, cucumbers, and one last attempt at watermelons in these pots that I will eventually put elsewhere as they kind of spread out and grow. But planting them here now gives me a head start in being able to have them further along for my actual fall garden when that time comes. Here in the South especially, cucurbits, aka cucumbers, pumpkins, and their friends, really struggle with things like squash vine borer beetles, with squash bugs, and lots of other pests that really can put a damper on your success with these things. So as a true lazy gardener, instead of trying to put in the BT injections and limping unhealthy plants along, succession planting of the most vigorous species I've ever found has been the ticket to actually getting some goodies. But my vines are usually only really good for one pretty robust harvest of a bunch of cucumbers, and then I've got to already have other ones going, which is why if we take a little walk through different parts of my garden, you're going to see a bunch of different cucumbers in different life stages. And that basically has me planting a new crop of cucumbers every couple weeks all summer long, and I limp that right along all the way to the end of the season. As we approach fall especially, though most people's single planting crop of cucumbers is definitely on the outs, my most successful cucumbers actually happen in my fall garden, because that's the time of year that we have the least pressure from the biggest cucurbit pests. And that's simply seasonal. Oh good, my cow is grooming my escaped pig, which has apparently just gotten right into the milking pen. And of course the cow itself is passive-aggressively telling me it is past time to milk. So we should do that. Please don't be a jerk. I understand you're very hungry and you're really annoyed that the pig is in here and everything else. Are you going to cooperate or no? Listen, she's in heat. She's been really annoyed by the alpacas and the pig. The dogs are right here. It's all okay. And who would have ever thought 12 years ago that I would have uttered a sentence like that. And here's the thing. 12 years ago, I planted my very first seed and picked up my very first tool. And along the way, I have cataloged every single one of those mistakes and hard-earned lessons on your behalf, so you don't actually have to experience the hard part. All of that is on my Squarespace website, annofalltrades.com. Squarespace is a fantastic resource for someone like me who is not at all tech savvy to be able to take everything that I want to share with the world and easily drag and drop it into a beautiful artist design template that then shares it with the world. You can learn all about composting, lazy gardening, animal husbandry, woodworking, and all the things. Jeffrey, hush! On my blog, annofalltrades.com. I use their scheduling app to book out my calendar. I can invoice clients using integrated software, and anyone who wants to spend money on my website can do so using tons of very flexible payment options. And now Squarespace can take you into the future of web design and content creation by using AI robots to help you do your work more efficiently. So if you have a great idea, something you're learning, maybe even just a photo gallery you want to share with potential future clients for a business idea you have, check out Squarespace. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/annofalltrades and you'll get a 10% discount. All right, Ella, are you ready to let me finish planting my fall garden? Yes or no? Good talk. Thank you so much for being here, my friend. If you want to see some more animal chaos just like this, check out this video. I'll see you there. Cheers!